So for the first time in 50 years, a massive energy shock is putting Asia through the ultimate stress test. And look, this isn't just about what you're paying at the pump. This is a fundamental challenge to whether the energy is even there to buy. And it's kicking off a huge chain reaction across the entire global economy. Okay, let's get into it. So let's start with a big question. What actually happens when a critical energy artery gets cut? I mean, just imagine for a second that the world's most important energy choke point is suddenly blocked. This is the kind of nightmare scenario that keeps policymakers up at night, and it forces us to really think, what happens when that lifeline is severed? And this heat map right here, it lays it all out pretty starkly, showing you just how vulnerable these different economies are. You can see those red and yellow zones. Those are the real hotspots. We're talking about major players like Taiwan, India, and Thailand feeling the pain first, and probably the worst. All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the shock itself. Then we'll trace the ripple effects through the crude oil crunch, the squeeze on gas and power, and this wild chemical chain reaction. And finally, we'll see how Asia is desperately trying to respond. Okay, let's get right into it. Starting with that first domino. And I really want to be clear here. This is not just another price hike. This is a shock to energy access. It's a question of whether the fuel is even available, at any price. Now, this diagram here, think of this as our roadmap for understanding this whole crisis. It shows you how everything, and I mean everything, is connected. Crude oil and natural gas, they aren't just fuels. Nope. They're the absolute starting point for pretty much everything, from the gas in our cars to the fertilizers that grow our food, and even the tiny components inside our smartphones. So you can see how a problem right at the source creates this massive, massive ripple effect all the way down the line. All right, let's move on to the most immediate hit, the crude oil crunch. When a major supply line gets cut off, the first question on everyone's mind is pretty simple. How much do we have in the tank? How long can we actually last on what we've stored away? And while this dependence, it's just staggering. I mean, just look at these numbers. Japan gets 93% of its crude oil from the Middle East. 93. For South Korea, it's 67%. And for a giant like India, it's over half. This isn't just reliance, folks. This is extreme exposure to anything that goes wrong in that one single region. But, being dependent is only half the story. The other, really critical half, is how prepared you are. And here, it's like a tale of two completely different situations. On one side, you've got Japan, sitting on a massive 242-day stockpile. That's a huge cushion. But then you look at India, and they've only got 40 days of inventory. 40. So you can see right away, the exact same crisis is going to hit these two nations very, very differently. Now, while oil always grabs the headlines, right, the bigger and maybe more severe crisis is actually happening almost behind the scenes with natural gas. This is what we could call the invisible crisis, and this is all about keeping the lights on and keeping factories running. So why is the situation with LNG, or liquefied natural gas, so much worse? Well, it really boils down to three key things. 1. Countries just store way less of it. 2. The infrastructure to store it is a lot more complex and expensive. And 3. There are simply fewer places you can call up to buy more when your main supplier goes dark. And get this, if you thought 40 days of oil was cutting it close, look at this. 6 days. That is India's entire LNG inventory. That's not a buffer, it's a countdown. This is exactly where an energy crunch can turn into a full-blown economic crisis, like overnight. This whole situation forces a really tough choice. On the one hand, you see the price for LNG just going through the roof. Asian buyers are paying these huge premiums just to get their hands on a shipment. And the result of that? Well, look over here. Coal is now suddenly dramatically cheaper. And that's forcing policymakers into this desperate pivot back to coal, which, could undo years and years of climate progress. Okay, so the dominoes just keep on falling. Let's look at the next phase of this crisis, the chemical chain reaction. This is where the shock moves beyond our gas tanks and our power grids and starts hitting the very materials that build our modern world. So to understand this, we need to know what a feedstock is. It sounds technical, but it's really simple. These are just the basic ingredients, stuff like naphtha and propane that are made from oil and gas. They are the absolute foundation for a huge range of industries. We're talking plastics, fertilizers, you name it. The equation is simple. No feedstock, no production, period. And the impact of not having enough feedstock is massive. This table shows nearly 24 million metric tons per year of petrochemical capacity being cut back or shut down entirely. We're seeing huge names in South Korea, Taiwan, and across the region. Companies like Lotacam and Formosa, being forced to just slam the brakes on production. So why does any of this matter to you? Because that feedstock shortage translates directly into things we all use every single day. A shortage of sulfur? That affects the production of semiconductors in your phone. Less plastic production? That means more expensive car parts. Limits on fertilizer? That's a direct threat to food security. It even gets down to the local level, where restaurants in India are literally struggling to get enough cooking gas. So this brings us to our final section, the desperate scramble to respond. With supply chains buckling under the pressure, how are these countries even trying to manage the damage? Well, it looks like a kind of four-part emergency playbook is emerging. Step 1, you release the emergency stockpiles. Step 2, you find anyone else who can sell you energy, which is why we're seeing India and China buying more Russian crude. Step 3, you have to conserve what you've got, and that means things like export bans or even 4-day work weeks. And step 4, as we saw, you switch to whatever fuel you can get your hands on, which right now means coal. And these aren't just abstract ideas. Here are the real-world consequences. Thailand has banned fuel exports. Ports in India are seeing delays up to 49 days. South Korea is capping fuel prices for the first time in 3 decades. The Philippines put government employees on a 4-day work week. This is what the crisis actually looks like on the ground. And this quote from the research just puts the sheer scale of this into perspective. 100 million barrels of crude released from emergency reserves, 25 million tons of petrochemical capacity shut down, 10 million tons of fertilizer production impacted. The numbers are just enormous.
All of this leaves us with one final big question. For decades, nations have been chasing this goal of energy independence. But as a crisis like this shows, in a world that's so deeply interconnected, with supply chains that are so fragile, is that goal even possible? Or is it, and has it always been, just an illusion?